As Air Force One descended onto British soil, the atmosphere in London was far from the polished pomp and ceremony usually associated with state visits. The arrival of U.S. President Donald Trump on his official trip to the United Kingdom instantly became the center of heated debate, widespread protests, and a deep reflection of the political divisions on both sides of the Atlantic. From the moment the state visit was announced, thousands of activists, opposition leaders, and ordinary citizens had vowed to take to the streets to express their dissatisfaction with his policies, rhetoric, and international stance. The protests were not only about Trump himself but also about what his presidency symbolized, a populist wave, often tinged with nationalism and controversy, that challenged long-standing political norms. As the president's convoy moved through heavily guarded routes in central London, chants of dissent echoed from Trafalgar Square to Parliament Square. Protesters carried colorful banners, witty placards, and some even revived the infamous Trump Baby Blimp, a giant inflatable caricature depicting him in a diaper, floating above the crowds as both a humorous jab and a striking political statement. The protests were meticulously organized, drawing support from trade unions, human rights organizations, environmental activists, and anti-racism campaigners, each group motivated by different grievances but united in their opposition to the American leader. At the same time, supporters of Trump, though fewer in number, also gathered in pockets across the city, waving American flags and cheering in solidarity with his leadership. This juxtaposition of support and opposition created a charged and polarized atmosphere that showcased not only Britain's complex relationship with the United States but also the wider tensions in Western politics during his presidency. For many Londoners, the demonstrations represented more than a protest against one man, they became a symbolic moment of resistance against policies they believed undermined climate action, global cooperation, and respect for diversity. The images of massive crowds filling iconic streets, surrounded by heavy police presence and international media coverage, underscored the significance of this moment, turning the streets of London into a stage where politics, protest, and diplomacy collided in real time. The state visit, designed to project strength, unity, and partnership between two nations, instead became a magnet for division and debate, ensuring that every step of the president's itinerary was shadowed by the voices of those who opposed him. While the grandeur of a state visit typically highlights royal pageantry, diplomatic speeches, and ceremonial gestures, what unfolded during Trump's time in London was overshadowed by the persistent wave of demonstrations that captured the world's attention. The second day of his visit was marked by a striking contrast. Inside Buckingham Palace, the president was welcomed with royal honors, greeted by Queen Elizabeth II, and escorted through elaborate state banquets. Outside, however, the streets told a completely different story. Thousands of protesters surged forward in central London, waving signs that read, "No to Trump, no to racism," and "Climate Justice Now," filling the air with chants that reverberated through Whitehall. It was a vivid reminder that politics cannot be confined to palatial halls and diplomatic dinners when the people outside feel so deeply invested in the narrative. The protests were not just fueled by Trump's stance on immigration, women's rights, or climate policy but also by his combative style of politics, his outspoken tweets, and his perceived disregard for international institutions like NATO, the United Nations, and multilateral climate accords. For many in the UK, his presence stirred feelings of both frustration and embarrassment, particularly given the timing. Britain itself was undergoing its own political turbulence with Brexit debates, leadership challenges, and questions about its future role in the world. In many ways, Trump's arrival seemed to amplify these divisions, with critics arguing that his style of politics reflected and even encouraged the kind of populism that had already fractured British politics. Yet, amid this strong opposition, there were also defenders of the visit who emphasized the importance of the special relationship between the US and the UK, insisting that diplomacy should transcend personal disagreements and public disapproval. Conservative voices within Britain highlighted Trump's firm stance on security, trade, and defense, arguing that maintaining close ties with Washington was essential as the UK prepared to redefine its global alliances post-Brexit. This division spilled across news broadcasts and panel discussions, with commentators debating whether hosting Trump was a diplomatic necessity or a political liability. The protests themselves evolved into a form of cultural expression, as Londoners used humor, satire, and performance art to send a message. From street musicians singing parodies of American anthems to activists dressed in elaborate costumes mocking Trump's persona, the demonstrations carried both gravity and theatricality. The Trump Baby Blimp, once again hovering above Parliament Square, became a defining image of resistance, a visual shorthand for a city's disapproval that circulated across global media. Police presence remained heavy but largely restrained, managing the crowds with caution to avoid clashes, though minor scuffles and heated confrontations occasionally flared up between opposing groups. Despite the tensions, the overall mood was one of determined yet peaceful defiance, a showcase of London's tradition of protest as a civic right and political expression. For those on the streets, the act of protesting was not only about sending a message to the U.S. president but also about signaling to their own leaders that hosting Trump without acknowledging public sentiment risked alienating the very people they served. International media outlets amplified these voices, beaming images of placards, chants, and symbolic acts across the globe, ensuring that the narrative of Trump's visit was as much about public resistance as it was about diplomacy. The story of the state visit, therefore, became less about official agreements or joint statements and more about how ordinary citizens reshaped the narrative through their collective action, leaving an indelible mark on the history of U.K. relations during this turbulent period. As the state visit drew to a close, the juxtaposition between the official ceremonies and the scenes on the streets highlighted the complex layers of diplomacy in a modern world where public opinion travels faster than any motorcade. While the images of President Trump alongside Queen Elizabeth II and other members of the royal family were broadcast to symbolize continuity in the so-called special relationship, they were equally rivaled by the vast footage of protests, chants, and satirical displays that defined the atmosphere beyond palace gates. Analysts later noted that this visit had less to do with actual policymaking and more to do with symbolism. A U.S. president, often described as divisive and unconventional, meeting the stability and tradition embodied by Britain's monarchy. Yet even this symbolic display was contested, as critics argued that extending such an honor to Trump sent the wrong message about Britain's values at a time when global issues such as climate change, migration crises, and human rights demanded principled leadership. For many protesters, their goal was never to disrupt or cause chaos, but rather to make their opposition impossible to ignore, to ensure that when the history of this visit was written, it would not be remembered solely for its ceremonies, but also for the voice of the people who stood against it. Interestingly, surveys taken during the visit suggested that while Trump remained unpopular among large segments of the British public, there was still recognition that maintaining ties with the United States was vital in the uncertain post-Brexit era. This paradox underscored the larger tension at play. The ability of nations to separate diplomacy from personal sentiment, and the power of citizens to hold leaders accountable through peaceful demonstration. The closing scenes of the visit saw the American president departing amidst tightened security and continued chants echoing across central London, leaving behind a trail of headlines that captured the essence of the moment. For supporters, his trip was framed as a successful reinforcement of alliances and a show of global stature. For opponents, it was a reminder that power without accountability provokes resistance, and that democracy is not only practiced in parliaments but also on pavements filled with voices demanding to be heard. In the days and weeks that followed, discussions about the protests carried on across television panels, online forums, and political debates, cementing the visit as one of the most contentious and memorable in recent history. Beyond the spectacle, it left open questions about the role of public opinion in shaping foreign relations, the balance between honoring traditions and respecting democratic values, and the way leaders will navigate diplomacy in an era where every move is scrutinized, challenged, and broadcast instantly around the globe. Ultimately, the protests in London were not simply about rejecting a single figure but about affirming broader ideals, respect for diversity, commitment to global cooperation, and the refusal to stay silent in the face of policies considered harmful to those values. And that, perhaps, is the most lasting image of Trump's state visit to the UK, not just the ceremonies inside royal walls, but the sea of citizens outside, holding signs, raising voices, and reminding the world that leadership, whether welcomed or contested, must always answer to the people.